I've always valued isolation. Living in a house tucked away in this quiet development, where the streetlights are sparse, provides the perfect sense of detachment I crave. My job, a remote programmer, only reinforced this discreet lifestyle. Everything was organized, predictable, and most importantly, safe. 6 months ago, I invested in a comprehensive security camera system, not because of any specific threat, but simply as a necessary precaution in this day and age. 3 cameras, positioned discreetly under the eaves and in the garden, covered almost the entire front and sides of the house. They were sleepless eyes recording every movement, every shadow that crossed my property line. Life proceeded steadily until mid-December, when the house across the street, which had been vacant for nearly a year, suddenly acquired new tenants. They moved in with almost total silence. Just a few small moving vans and the vague presence of a slender woman in a thick coat against the cold weather. I didn't think much of the new neighbor. I'm not one for socializing, after all. I didn't even catch her name. Everything began to change that Friday night. I was reviewing the week's camera logs, a frequent habit to ensure the system was functioning properly. The time slot between 2 and 3 a.m. was usually just a series of static frames, occasionally interrupted by a passing car or a stray cat. But tonight, there was a different recording. Camera number 2, which faces the cobblestone driveway leading up to the house, had registered motion. In the center of the frame, about 10 meters from my wooden fence, a figure was standing. The person stood silently, completely still for a few minutes, facing my house. Then her body began to move. Not walking, not lurking, but a choreographed performance. The woman began to dance. She wasn't in warm gear, but a light, flowing, all-white dress, utterly unsuited to the cold at 2:47 a.m. She glided over the snow-turned slush, executing steps that were eerily precise and graceful. It was a waltz. Her arms rose high, she spun, creating a haunting, almost surreal image under the dim glow of my porch light. I stopped the video, a feeling of bewilderment mixed with unease. I pressed play again. Suddenly the dance ceased. The woman turned her face directly towards the camera lens. Even in the slightly blurry resolution and poor light, I could make out her face, and I recognized her. It was Lyra. Lyra. The name echoed in my mind like a cold chime carrying the memory of a chaotic year that had ended 3 years ago. Our relationship was a whirlwind of obsession, where she went from a passionate lover to a relentless controller. Its ending was a liberation, an escape without looking back. I had changed my number, blocked every social media account, and moved to this city specifically to cut all ties. I had been sure I was safe, but Lyra was now standing less than 20 meters away from me, my new neighbor, dancing a macabre waltz in front of my house at nearly 3 a.m. I rewound the footage, feeling betrayed by my own false sense of security. She never did anything randomly. If she was here, it was because she had found me. She had been looking for me, and now she was in plain sight. The next night, I checked the cameras again. Around 1:30 a.m., Lyra reappeared. This time, she was closer. She stood right against the wooden fence, leaning into it, staring directly at the position of camera number 2. She was still in the white dress, but today's dance was no longer a waltz. It was a controlled chaos. Her body twisted at sharp, awkward, almost painful angles. The dance resembled a seizure, yet every movement was disturbingly deliberate. She wasn't dancing for music. She was dancing for my attention, for the lens itself. What froze me wasn't the dance, but her face. Lyra's eyes were wide, unblinking and staring. They were cold like broken glass, devoid of any warmth or confusion. And then she smiled. It was a smile without joy, pulling her lips into a pale, stretched rictus, revealing perfectly straight teeth, grotesque and malignant. She knew I was watching. She was performing for me. I quickly saved the video to an encrypted folder. I checked all the door and window locks, tightening the blinds. The sense of being watched was no longer a vague anxiety. It had become a physical weight on my chest. I knew what I was dealing with. She was the definition of toxic persistence. The next 3 nights, Lyra didn't appear. The silence was even worse than her presence. I kept glancing at my laptop screen, the camera app open. I began to wonder if I was imagining it, if the stress was making me paranoid. On Thursday night, I caught her again. This time, she chose camera number 3, aimed at the side of my house where the small laundry room window is. She walked straight out of the side shadow without hesitation. I could see Lyra was holding something in her hand, a dark, heavy object that dimly reflected the porch light. Her prominent white dress was in stark contrast to the dark act about to occur. Lyra stopped in front of the laundry window, an old and relatively small pane of glass. She turned her face towards the camera for 1 second, just 1 second, enough for me to register a look not of her usual madness, but of frightening concentration. She lifted the heavy object in her hand, and without a dance, without any preamble, she smashed it violently against the pane. I didn't need to hear the sound. The image on the screen was enough. The glass shattered instantly, a spiderweb of cracks forming before large shards fell onto the windowsill. I watched Lyra snake her hand through the newly created opening, reaching for the latch inside. She was attempting to break in instantly, right now. I was completely paralyzed for a second. Then self-preservation surged. I had wrestled with Lyra for years, but this time she had turned the threat from mental to physical. I knew I couldn't confront her, especially now that she had resorted to violence. I grabbed my phone, bolted out of the kitchen, and hid in the master bedroom, the furthest corner of the house. I locked the door, wedging a heavy dresser across it. The action was pointless if Lyra was determined to break the door, but it bought me precious seconds. I called the emergency number. My voice was shaky, but I managed to stay calm while presenting the situation. I spoke of my ex-girlfriend, her obsession, and now her attempt to break the window in the back of my house. I stressed that I had video proof of her trespassing over several nights. She's in the backyard. I heard the glass break. I whispered into the phone, trying to control my breathing. The waiting in silence was the worst. I heard the dispatcher reassuring me, saying that officers were on the way. I stared at the bedroom door, then back at my phone screen, where the security camera app was still open. Camera number 3 had shifted from the image of the window to Lyra's hand reaching in. Then the screen flickered and went black. She had realized the camera's location and disabled it. I knew I didn't have much time. Lyra had been in my sight, and now she was within arm's reach. Panic mounted as I waited. Could Lyra get inside before the police arrived? Just then, a sound echoed from the front. It was the wail of a police siren, faint at first, but quickly growing louder as the cruiser turned onto my street. The sound was not just a relief for me. It seemed to be a signal for Lyra. I looked at the screen for camera number 2, facing the front yard. I saw Lyra emerge at the end of the driveway. She wasn't running, but she was moving fast. Her white dress billowed in the darkness, turning her into a fleeting wraith. She abandoned her work at the window to escape. She didn't run towards her house, but straight toward the dense bushes and woods behind the neighborhood, vanishing into the darkness just before the flashing blue and red lights of the police car bathed my property. When the police arrived, they found me in the barricaded bedroom, shaking and exhausted. I gave them the hard drive containing the video clips, including the footage of Lyra dancing and finally, her breaking the window before disabling the camera. The officers confirmed the laundry room window had been smashed and Lyra had cut a hole large enough to reach the latch. They filed reports for stalking and attempted breaking and entering. Although Lyra had fled, with the video evidence and clear property damage, she couldn't evade justice this time. A few days later, I received notification of a restraining order and that Lyra had vacated the house across the street. The consequences had occurred and I had survived. I hadn't been pulled back into her world of chaos. However, I am no longer at ease. I know she was close. She danced on my doorstep, asserting her control and her madness. She broke my window. Now every time I check the cameras, I don't just look for cars or animals. I look for the color white. I look for Lyra. I look for that cold smile. The sense of security is completely ruined. My sleep is still fitful, haunted by the image of a white dress gliding in the dark and the silent sound of breaking glass on a screen. I survived, but I also know that Lyra is a person who doesn't accept an ending. She's only moving on to the next stage, and I will forever be the viewer, waiting for the next midnight ballet. My name is Julian Vance. I moved to the quiet suburbs of upstate New York in late autumn, seeking absolute serenity. I wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of the big city, craving a life where solitude was a luxury. The small two-story house I rented faced an old Victorian clapboard house, covered in withered wisteria vines. That house belonged to Mrs. Alastair. Mrs. Alastair was the only neighbor I truly interacted with during the first week. She was aged, petite, always dressed in long, dark dresses, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She didn't welcome me with baked goods, but with a stare. That stare fixed on me every time I got out of my car, worked in the garden, or simply stood on the porch for a smoke. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the harmless curiosity of a lonely old woman. But that stare wasn't harmless. It was deep, heavy, as if she was trying to tear my skin apart to see something inside. One afternoon, while carrying a heavy box upstairs, I paused by the window and looked out. Mrs. Alastair was standing at her window on the second floor, next to a small porcelain statue. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood there, hands clasped, face expressionless. But the moment I saw her, something shifted in those old eyes. Recognition. Something suddenly flared up. A few days later, I received a gift, a meatloaf wrapped in aluminum foil placed on my doorstep. There was no note, but I knew who sent it. I was going to throw it away, but then I decided I should be polite. I walked across the street and knocked on Mrs. Alastair's door. The door opened, releasing a scent of old wood and dried lavender. I thanked her for the meatloaf and started to turn away. Mrs. Alastair grabbed my arm. Her grip was much stronger than her frail appearance suggested. "You're home now," she whispered, her voice raspy and trembling. "My David." I shuddered and pulled back. I didn't ask, didn't argue. I just yanked my arm free and hurried back home. That name struck me hard, echoing in my mind. That night, I searched online for Mrs. Alastair in the house across the street. I quickly learned the tragic truth. Her only son, David, had died in a car accident about 10 years ago, at the age of 25. I was 27. I looked at the small photo of David in an old article. The resemblance was uncanny, even chilling. The same jawline, the same width of the shoulders, even the way his hair fell over his forehead. From that moment on, I no longer considered those stares harmless. I felt like I wasn't living in my own house anymore. I was residing in someone else's delusion. Mrs. Alastair's attention grew more intense, more intrusive. One morning I woke up and found a navy blue sweater neatly folded on my sofa armrest. I didn't remember owning one like it. It was an old cashmere, frayed at the wrists, and I could faintly smell a gentle fabric softener. I knew it wasn't mine. I threw it in the outdoor trash bin. The next evening, I found the sweater, freshly washed, hanging on my fence. I started locking my doors more carefully, checking the deadbolts before bed. I even bought a simple security camera system for the front and back porches. The gifts kept coming: a carefully packed breakfast, an old book on fishing, an antique key placed under the doormat. My anxiety turned into vigilance. I began to notice small details. When I left for work, I always left a book open on the kitchen counter as a secret flag. When I returned, the book was closed or slightly shifted. She was getting into my house. The camera system never captured any images of Mrs. Alastair at the front or back door. This made it all the more terrifying. How was she getting in? One Friday evening, I realized something was truly wrong. I had just finished showering and stepped into my bedroom. Neatly placed on the nightstand was a framed photograph. It was an old black and white picture, perhaps 20 years old. In the photo, a boy smiled, his hair curly. The face was David's, but what froze me was the background. It was this very room, the one I was standing in. I flipped the photo over. The shaky handwriting read, "You always remembered this bed, didn't you?" I had changed the locks on all the doors after Mrs. Alastair called me David. However, I had missed one thing: an old basement window, hidden behind dense shrubs. I went down to the basement, shining my flashlight on the rotting wood frame. The thick dust on the sill had been wiped clean in a streak. She didn't pick the lock. She probably used the house's original keys from a bygone era. I slumped onto the cold floor, struggling to breathe. This was not harmless dementia. This was premeditation. She was turning my life into a play, and I was the unwilling star forced to play her dead son. I decided to confront her. I couldn't live like this anymore. I called the local police, but they only logged a non-damaging trespassing incident. involving an elderly woman with known psychological issues due to loss. They advised me to be understanding and consider installing better security locks. I knew the police wouldn't help. I had to leave. But before I did, I needed to ensure she wouldn't do this to the next tenant. I made a plan. I would pack over the weekend, but I would pretend everything was normal. I removed the front porch security camera to create a false sense of security. Saturday evening, I saw the lights on in the house across the street. Mrs. Alastair was preparing something. I watched her through the window. She wasn't looking out. She wore an old kitchen apron, moving slowly in the yellow-lit kitchen. She seemed to be setting the dining table. My stomach clenched when I realized she had set the table for two. The next morning, I found a small folded note tucked under my car's windshield wiper. I opened it. It was written in fountain pen, in a formal yet trembling hand like an invitation. My dearest David, tonight, 7 o'clock. Our first dinner in so long. Mother made your favorite potato meatloaf. Don't keep me waiting. You know the consequences. It wasn't a threat. It was the imposition of a mother on a seemingly irresponsible son. I knew this was the climax. I couldn't just run away. If I left, she might go insane and do something unpredictable. I needed a brief confrontation, just enough to assert reality and escape. I texted my best friend in the city, telling him I'd call him back after 8 p.m. If I didn't call, he should contact the police and give them my address. 6:55 p.m. I put on my thick coat and crossed the street. Mrs. Alastair's door was slightly ajar. The house was completely silent. This silence was more terrifying than any noise. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of meatloaf and dried lavender enveloped me. I walked into the living room. The room was almost completely dark, lit only by the weak candlelight on the dining table. Mrs. Alastair was sitting at the head of the table. She was wearing a formal black lace dress. She was smiling, a smile I had never seen. Radiant, yet utterly unfamiliar and wrong. "You're right on time, David," she said, gesturing toward the chair opposite her, which had been pulled out. "I am not David," I said, my voice low and firm. "My name is Julian. Your son is dead." Mrs. Alastair's face froze. The candlelight highlighted the deep wrinkles on her face. "What strange things are you saying? You must be tired. Sit down. I spent all day preparing this meal." I stood still. I tried to find the quickest exit, but Mrs. Alastair was blocking the only way out of the room. "I am leaving now," I said. "You need to accept the truth." Mrs. Alastair slowly rose. Her eyes, shadowed in the darkness, seemed to glitter with madness. "No, you're not going anywhere. You just got home. I won't let you leave me again." She reached out, not to touch me. She reached for the object placed right beside her chair. A heavy steel gardening hammer with a smooth wooden handle. I reacted instantly. I didn't scream, I just acted. I shoved the nearest chair toward Mrs. Alastair to create a momentary distraction. The old woman shrieked and ducked to avoid the wooden chair. I bolted straight for the exit. But this house was a labyrinth. I took the wrong turn. Instead of heading for the front door, I plunged into a narrow hallway leading to a back bedroom. Mrs. Alastair was up, the hammer firmly in her hand. She wasn't running, she was walking. But her speed, in that state of deadly focus, was terrifying. I tried to open a bedroom door, locked. I slammed my fist against the door. It didn't budge. I turned around. Mrs. Alastair was at the end of the hallway. The darkness made her look like a blurred silhouette, only the hammer reflecting the candlelight. "Go to your room, David," she whispered. "I've prepared everything." I smashed the glass of a nearby bookcase with my elbow and pulled out a brass candlestick. I got into a ready stance. Mrs. Alastair didn't back down. She advanced. I aimed for her hand where she held the hammer, but she dodged with surprising agility. She swung the hammer. I stepped back and the sound of the hammer hitting the wall created a deep dent. I realized her strength wasn't physical, but a maniacal determination. She wasn't afraid. She just wanted her son back. I knew I couldn't fight her head on. I had to get out of this house. I ran back toward the kitchen, hoping for a back door. Mrs. Alastair was right behind me. The kitchen was full of knives and sharp objects. I didn't want violence, but survival was the priority. I grabbed a large kitchen knife placed next to the sink. When Mrs. Alastair entered the kitchen, I stood between her and the door. "Stop," I ordered. Mrs. Alastair looked at me. Her face was tear-streaked, completely shattered. "Do you hate your mother? After all this time, do you still hate me?" She didn't throw the hammer. She lunged forward unexpectedly, throwing her entire aged body at me like a train of bone and skin. I retreated, the knife still in my hand, but she managed to grab me. Her bony fingers dug into my coat. "You're not going anywhere. No one is going to take you away from me again." I used all my strength to push her away. Mrs. Alastair staggered but didn't fall. Her face contorted with effort, her eyes bloodshot, and she immediately lunged again as if gravity no longer affected her. I had no other choice. I raised the knife and yelled, "Stay away from me!" Mrs. Alastair stopped abruptly. She stared at the knife in my hand, then looked up at my face and a wrenching sob escaped her throat. "What are you doing, David? Are you going to hurt your mother?" Taking advantage of her emotional imbalance, I dropped the knife and lunged straight for the back door. The door was bolted from the outside. I had to use all my strength to break through the rusty latch. I ran out, through the backyard, looking for a way out through the wooden fence. But behind the fence I saw a small wooden structure. The door was open. I stepped inside. It was a garden shed, but in the center of the floor was an old, large refrigerator. A dry, unpleasant odor hung in the air. I opened the refrigerator door. There was no food inside. There was an old set of clothes neatly folded, next to an ebony urn containing ashes. But the most horrifying thing was an old journal lying on top. The last page was marked, "Tonight, David will sleep in his bed. Tomorrow we won't need food anymore." I realized Mrs. Alastair wasn't just obsessed with her son. She had prepared for my end, believing I was David trying to run away again. And this time she would make sure I could never leave. I wanted to vomit, but I channeled all my energy into running. I climbed over the fence, never looking back. I ran nonstop. I burst into the street, running through several blocks, the faint streetlights being my only markers. I no longer felt cold or pain. I just ran. When I was a few blocks away from the house, I stopped, collapsed on the roadside, and made a call. Not to my friend, to the police. I described the break-in, the gardening hammer, and the secret room in detail. I didn't mention David, just a dangerous woman who had tried to attack me. A few minutes later, the sound of police sirens echoed in the quiet night. I never went back to that house. I just waited at the police station giving my statement. The next morning, I learned Mrs. Alastair had been found at home. She wasn't seriously injured, but was in severe mental distress from the struggle and was taken for psychiatric evaluation. The police found evidence in the shed that confirmed my story. As for me, I didn't retrieve any of my remaining belongings. I moved out the very next day, taking only the essentials in my car. Although I survived, the memory of the house across the street still haunts me. Sometimes in a new apartment, hundreds of miles from upstate New York, I catch my own reflection in the window. I look closely at the jawline, the width of my shoulders, and the way my hair falls. And I wonder if perhaps Mrs. Alastair was partly right. I wonder if I am wearing the face of a dead man, and that resemblance has created a small crack in my own reality. I have always believed that the greatest horrors are not hidden in dark forests or abandoned houses, but rather dwell right beneath the bright sunshine of a perfectly manicured residential area, where architectural flawlessness and meticulously trimmed lawns serve as a thick veneer, concealing the decay within. I moved to Oak Haven Avenue 3 years ago. It was a quiet, affluent suburb, where everything was arranged according to an admirable, if sometimes terrifying, order. My neighbors, whom I knew only through quick, polite nods while retrieving mail, were all paragons of stability. All that is, except Silas. Silas lived directly across my tall, white wooden fence. He was a middle-aged man, gaunt with pale blue eyes that always held an undefined look of irritation. Silas lived alone, and his life was a study in repetition. Everything about Silas adhered to a rigorous schedule. He mowed the lawn on Saturday precisely at 9 a.m., using an old red push mower. He watered his plants at 6 p.m. sharp every summer evening, no sooner, no later, and every night at exactly 1 a.m., a dim light would flicker on in his detached shed at the back, a light that lasted only 15 minutes, long enough to complete some nameless task before plunging back into absolute darkness. Initially, I simply dismissed Silas as an eccentric, lonely man. But as I started working from home, spending more time looking out my windows, his habits began to feel deeply unsettling. This was especially true regarding the wooden fence separating our 2 yards. The fence was an old structure, already decaying in several places. While most people would have replaced it, Silas had an unusual approach: patchwork. But his patches weren't for standard repair. He used small, slightly mismatched planks, fastening them tightly over small gaps near the ground, spots that a casual observer would never notice. I wondered why someone so obsessively meticulous would intentionally create such a visually jarring, haphazard construction, unless its purpose was not aesthetic preservation. One night I couldn't sleep. Perhaps it was the low hum of the air conditioner, or perhaps the vague dread of knowing Silas's shed light was about to switch on. When the clock struck 1 silu, I was already stationed at the window of my spare bedroom, which offered the best view of Silas's yard. The light came on. Silas stepped out of the shed. He wasn't carrying gardening tools. In his hand was a dark, oddly shaped object, and he walked in a near-perfect straight line toward my fence. I noted that rather than using a back gate or a side door, he always followed this invisible coordinate line from the shed to the barrier. In the weak glow of the shed light, I saw him crouch down, right near one of those strange patches. He made an action that appeared to be pressing or removing something. Then he stood up straight, staring intently into my empty yard. Despite the distance, I felt as if Silas's eyes were piercing the darkness, penetrating the wall, and looking directly at my position. The action lasted only a few seconds before he retreated back into the shed, and the light went out. I backed away from the window, the chill running through me, not fear, but a cold, hard confirmation. Silas wasn't just maintaining his garden. He was systematically observing me through those concealed openings. The next morning, the feeling of being watched lingered. I could no longer dismiss Silas's actions as harmless quirkiness. If those patches were observation points, his obsession had crossed the line from typical neighborly eccentricity into something much darker. But peeping was one thing. Silas's terrifying fastidiousness was another. I decided to inspect the fence. I went into the yard, trying to project a casual appearance, as if I were merely checking my plants. When I got close to the fence, I stooped down to examine the patch I'd seen Silas interacting with. It was not a simple patch. Beneath the hastily applied, faded paint, I felt a tiny, precisely drilled hole, no more than a few millimeters in diameter. It was positioned at the perfect height, relative to the eye level of a person crouched in his yard, or perhaps the height of a small camera lens. Upon further inspection, I realized there were 5 similar holes along the fence line, all masked by those deliberately clumsy, patched-up planks, located precisely on the paths Silas habitually walked. The discovery of this observation system shattered my perception of Oakhaven. Silent Avenue was no longer a paradise. It was a beautifully decorated prison, and I was the subject of the experiment. That's when I began to question. If Silas were merely curious, he wouldn't require such military precision. This patience, the ritualistic repetition of his 1 a.m. work, had to serve a grander purpose, one that didn't involve watching me eat dinner or read a book. A few days later, a small but chilling detail forced me to reevaluate everything. I have a cat, Mittens, who loved to roam the garden. She usually slept on the porch chair, but that week Mittens vanished. I searched everywhere, calling her name, putting up flyers with genuine anxiety. As I was taping a flyer onto a lamppost 2 houses down from Silas's, I caught Silas trimming the rose bushes near his gate. He completely ignored me, but I noticed something. Beneath his own fence line, not the shared one, but the fence running along his side path, there was a small area of newly disturbed earth, maybe only a foot wide, covered thickly with artificial moss secured by small pins. I knew that garden well. Silas was obsessive about maintaining the status quo. There was no reason he would dig up the soil and then disguise it with fake moss in the middle of summer. A cold realization began to seep in. Mittens never went far, and if Silas hated animals straying into his yard, his solution was likely more permanent than shooing them away. I realized that Silas's meticulousness didn't just apply to observation. It applied to concealment. Sleep became impossible. Every night, I watched the clock waiting for 1 a.m. and the brief, frantic activity of my neighbor. I started paying close attention to Silas's shed. It was an old structure, windowless, built of thick oak. In the heat of August, sometimes a strange odor would drift over the fence. A sweet, pungent smell, like industrial cleaning chemicals mixed with something organic and stale. I tried to tell myself it was over-fertilization, but the chemical scent was overpowering. Determined to uncover the secret, I devised a plan. I needed a better concealed vantage point. My garden featured an ancient maple tree with thick branches extending high over the fence. On Saturday night, the night of meticulous work, I waited until the neighborhood was completely silent. Around 12:30 a.m., I put on gloves, took a small flashlight wrapped in hazy tape to dim the beam, and climbed the maple. I lay still on a sturdy branch, patiently gazing down into the yard below. Precisely at 1 a.m., the shed light came on. This time, Silas carried a large, opaque white plastic bucket. He moved slowly and deliberately. The light from the shed cast a long, distorted shadow, making him look like a gaunt creature shuffling across the ground. He didn't approach my fence. Instead, he went to the back of the shed, where there was a small concrete pad enclosed by 3 wooden privacy screens. This area was usually obscured from view, but from the tree I had a clear sightline. Silas poured the liquid from the bucket down a small drain hole located at the edge of the concrete pad. The chemical smell was exponentially stronger than anything I'd smelled before. I had to cover my nose to avoid being overwhelmed by the heavy fumes. What terrified me was not the pouring of the liquid. It was what followed. Silas used a small hose to rinse the bucket, and then he meticulously wiped every square inch of the concrete pad dry with a gray rag. He wiped until there was not a single water spot, not a trace left behind. This was not the cleanliness of someone maintaining property. It was the cleanliness of someone eradicating evidence. As Silas turned to enter the shed, I focused the faint beam of my flashlight on the area he had just cleaned. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but finally I saw it. The edge of the concrete was darker, more saturated in color, as if permanently stained. And right near the drain hole, there was a faint, thread-thin streak of pale reddish-brown, nearly scrubbed away but still clinging. It looked exactly like diluted blood. I held my breath. Silas was a killer. The mechanical repetition, the peepholes in the fence, Mittens' disappearance. It was all part of a system of concealment and surveillance. Cold sweat broke out on my face, not from fear of heights, but from the realization that I was perched in a tree, adjacent to the house of a predator. And then, just as Silas stepped inside the shed, and before he extinguished the light, I saw him turn his head and look directly toward the maple tree. Even though he couldn't possibly see me in the deep shadows, the act made every nerve ending in my body contract. Silas had deviated from his schedule. He paused deliberately, as if anticipating a reaction. Did he know he wasn't alone in the garden tonight? I scrambled down from the tree in near panic. I knew I couldn't call the police immediately. My evidence consisted only of a chemical odor, vague stains, and the erratic behavior of a neighbor. The police would dismiss me as overly stressed. I needed irrefutable proof. I realized that Silas's surveillance system worked both ways. If he could see me, I could see him. And I had to exploit his obsession with order. A few days later, I made a dangerous move. While Silas was out, I knew he went grocery shopping every Tuesday morning, precisely at 10:15, and returned at 11:30. I went outside and deliberately disturbed a small patch of grass right next to the shared fence near one of his observation holes. I tossed a small, thoroughly washed, empty milk carton onto the ground. At exactly 11:30, Silas returned. He walked straight into his garden. I watched from inside through the curtain. He saw the milk carton. His face betrayed no emotion, but the tension in his shoulders was palpable. Silas could not tolerate disorder. He picked up the carton, but before discarding it, he stared down at the disturbed patch of earth. And then he did the unexpected. Silas crouched down, not to smooth the grass, but to gently push a specific patched plank. The plank slid slightly outward, revealing a small inner space, not large enough for a person, but ample enough to conceal an object. He retrieved a small square item. I instantly knew what it was: a portable hard drive. Silas was recording his observations, and possibly his actions. As he went inside, I knew my time was up. The slight disorder of the milk carton had prompted him to check his storage device. He would review the recordings, and if he realized the disruption was caused by me, I would become his next target. I had to act immediately, while he was preoccupied with the hard drive. I grabbed a small hatchet I used for splitting firewood and went straight out to the garden. I didn't need to break into the shed. I only needed to disable his surveillance network. Arriving at the fence, I searched for more hidden details. Directly under the patch where Silas had hidden the hard drive, I spotted a slender green cable running along the ground and disappearing beneath the fence. It was too thin to be a standard power cord. It was a signal line. I raised the hatchet and brought it down hard on the spot where the cable vanished beneath the fence. The sound was not loud, just a dull thunk, but it was enough. Instantly, the lights in Silas's house flared on. I heard the back door open. I had no time to flee. I had to stay and play the role of an accidental culprit. Silas appeared. He carried nothing but icy rage and burning eyes. He saw me standing by the fence, hatchet in hand, and the fresh split in the wooden planks. He moved toward me with alarming speed, not running but walking fast, his strides perfectly measured. "What are you doing?" His voice was low and dry. "I'm sorry," I said, forcing a falsely calm tone. I was clearing some dry wood. My hand slipped and the hatchet hit the fence. "I will repair it." Silas stopped. He stood less than 2 meters away. He didn't look at the crack. He looked straight into my eyes, searching for any sign of deception. "What did you see?" Silas asked, completely ignoring my explanation. "I don't understand," I replied, my heart pounding so loudly I feared he could hear it. He took one more step. In that moment, I knew he would not let me live if he thought I knew his secret. Everything was real, without any supernatural force, just the sheer brutality of a psychopath accustomed to concealment. Silas reached out his hand not to strike, but to grab my throat. I reacted. I wasn't a fighter, but I had the physical advantage and the desperate clarity of a cornered person. I used the hand holding the hatchet to shove hard against his chest. Silas stumbled back, surprise briefly flashing across his face. Perhaps he hadn't expected a mundane neighbor to fight back so aggressively. In the moment he lost his footing, I didn't run. I knew if I turned my back, he would quickly catch up. Instead, I backed away rapidly, keeping my eyes fixed on him. I shouted not for help, but as a warning. "I called the police. They are already on their way." It was a lie, but it made him hesitate. Silas's priority was always order and concealment. Instead of pursuing me, Silas spun around, sprinting towards his shed. He did not want to be caught in the yard with me. He needed to deal with the evidence. As soon as he vanished behind the shed door, I ran inside my house, locking every door and window. I grabbed my phone, not calling 911 immediately, but dialing the non-emergency police line. "I need a patrol car sent to Oak Haven Avenue, house 273. My neighbor Silas just attacked me. I believe he is hiding something terrible in his shed. He cut off my security system, and I think he is a serial killer." I spoke quickly, urgently, delivering a narrative dramatic enough to force a rapid response. While waiting, I hid in the living room, away from the windows. Less than 10 minutes later, the wail of police sirens echoed through Oak Haven Avenue. 2 patrol cars stopped in front of Silas's house. I saw through the curtain gap as the officers entered Silas's yard. They knocked on the shed door. No response. They broke the lock. It wasn't long before I saw one officer signal to the others. Then they retreated from the shed, their faces pale. Moments later, a forensic vehicle arrived. I never learned precisely what the police found inside Silas's shed. Perhaps it was mittens, or perhaps it was more gruesome evidence of people who had gone missing in the area over the years. Victims who had been observed, stalked and then processed with the same obsessive cleanliness Silas pursued. Silas himself had vanished. Perhaps he had an escape route. Perhaps he had used the ensuing chaos to melt back into the neighborhood's facade of order. But I survived. I won, not through brute force, but by recognizing that even the most meticulous psychopath has a weakness: their devotion to routine. Although Silas was placed on a wanted list and never found in Oak Haven, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I looked out, the fence still stood there, and the ground beside the concrete pad still retained that dark stain. The neighborhood remained quiet, but I knew that silence was a deception. I knew that even if Silas was gone, his phantom, the chilling truth hidden beneath the perfection of the suburb, would haunt me forever.